let's say, the positives of the Electoral Commission and how it might commence its work, in that there are clearly identifiable modules, if I could use the word, that are currently carrying out work under the auspices of perhaps the Standards in Public Office or the Department or whatever, and those regulatory functions would constitute a far easier transfer than some of the other matters. I suppose going down to what returning officers meet on a daily basis in election events, and I know that I share this with all of the elected representatives, that's the register. Like a lot of these questions, it's not simple. The answer is not simple. However, there's, I think, a willingness all around that in the new environment in which we find ourselves with, let's say, social media and all those other benefits of communication, we have seen an example in the last referendum where, through the efforts of the Referendum Commission, and I would suggest many other agencies, there's a big turnout at referendums, not least, I suppose, because of the question that was asked. But the electoral register, I believe, if I could just concentrate on that for a moment, can be improved immeasurably, and we don't have to wait for the finality of an electoral commission, is the message I would give. I know that dealing and working closely with the local authorities, as I have over the last 19 years, and quite rightly, it was pointed out there are 31 different registers. They're extremely willing and able to embrace new technology and trying to improve the effectiveness of voter registration. There are positives and negatives. The negatives, quite rightly pointed out by Deputy Stanley, is the reduced intelligence on the ground compared to days gone by. PPS numbers, we have in our main statement suggested that whatever the let's say difficulties in utilising PPS numbers, we should definitely look at it. I believe the register would certainly benefit from being able to utilise PPS numbers in some way. But there are data issues and other issues around that, and I wouldn't be qualified or let's say definitive as to how they would be dealt with, but I do believe they should be dealt with. I believe it will take some legislative arrangements to consider those matters. Voter registration is one of the big ones, but in terms then of the other matters you mention, regulatory transfer of functions, it's our view and my view personally much easier to tend to than the greater matters of transfer to an electoral commission. But the difficulties in that, and I would echo Mr. Tyndall in this, is the methodology should be phased, but it should also be deadlined. And it's up to the body here and perhaps ultimately the Commission itself as to how that would take place. Appointments, again, I suppose I'm only echoing a personal view. My own personal view echoes that of the other speakers. Any appointments to an electoral commission will have greater, let's say, I use the word legitimacy in a certain sense, if they're completely independent. And for that, we would welcome some form of independent oversight by the Houses of the Oireachtas rather than the government. But that's, again, for something to be decided down the road.
Thank you, Mr. Murphy. Mr. Murray.
Thank you, Gaeltacht. Just again echoing and responding to Deputy Stanley in the context of first acknowledging that we would agree that it should remain as local as is possible in terms of politics, and the connectivity that we refer to in our submission is extremely important as we go forward. But there are issues which are being referred to consistently around the issue and the current process around the register itself. And the incident referred to, while not acceptable, is more the exception than the rule. The reality that we face in the context, the timelines currently imposed, leave us in a very difficult position when faced, as has been referred to, when you get a substantial increase in the number of people who wish to register at the last minute. and Dublin City faced that in probably larger numbers than the rest of us with the recent referendum. All very good, but it does present challenges in that regard. And we have recommended and suggested that, one, the move to a rolling register would take those timeline pressures out, give far more chance to actually have the accuracy that is necessary, and in preparation for any referendum or indeed election that would come with that. In addition to that, we've made play around the issue of the unique identifier, because the lack of a unique identifier in the current electoral system means that registration authorities have no way of cross-checking within the relevant jurisdiction or indeed outside your jurisdiction itself. And it can lead subsequently to duplication and indeed electoral fraud. So we need a change in both legislative process to enable the register to improve. There is absolutely no lack of willingness or indeed expertise to respond to the issues that have been referred to here actually on the ground itself. But it does require change, and I would welcome the fact that this discussion has taken place and hope that it would lead to that type of change.
Right, Deputy Murphy.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think there's any danger of a big bang approach, let me put it that way. I think the very fact that this has happened in this part of the electoral cycle, and the Minister himself has stated that getting it up and running is the main thing, but completely echoed the points that have been made. That doesn't mean that it has to go on forevermore, that we have to decide on what it is, what's going to be included, and within what time frame. And I think there's got to be certainty about that, and I think that we've got to be very clear about that. And I think, where there's inevitably a concentration on the electoral register, obviously this is a much bigger enterprise than that, and should be. And I think there's very good examples in other countries that are of a comparable size that I think we can learn some lessons from. I'd echo a lot of what has been said in relation to the returning officers. I've never ever had a doubt about an election, and I've contested plenty of elections myself, but I've always felt that you can be absolutely confident in the process, and even though sometimes it takes a little bit longer and you don't have the time for celebration that you'd like to have on the particular day and all the rest of it. So, but I think that there are good things within our system, and I think that we shouldn't lose those. So it's important that we're thoughtful about how we proceed. I would like to see a lot of things included. I'd like to know what the ultimate goal is and what you would include. And I'd like to see, for example, the issue of political funding being most definitely a part. And I think that would actually be important in terms of confidence building. The idea, and Michael Marsh said it last week, that by establishing a referendum commission each time is actually very wasteful. And the one thing that he took from each of the reports were that that he all said that if they had more time. So I think there is the symmetry that would be that would come from having a permanency. I think would be very beneficial, and I think would probably be less wasteful, and we could learn some lessons from it. So I think that would be really important. I was quite interested about the point, the conflict or potential conflict with the CNAG as the accounting officer, and you might just pick that up again and just maybe go back over that particular point, because that's the one thing that we've got to make sure is that when we do something that we've properly thought it out. I've often felt that we maybe understate. And we most definitely do understate the turnout by virtue of the condition of the register, the duplication. In fact, sometimes I think we probably count the full register, where in fact there's a lot of people on the electoral register can only vote for in local elections, or but the duplication is perhaps the main issue, and I'd like to see, for example, a greater degree of postal voting, where people go on holidays and want to make an arrangement and don't want to be disenfranchised. So I think there's a lot of things that we can think about how we would do things differently. In relation to the House of the Oireachtas, it's not a perfect entity either, because it's not just in actual fact there's a whole sections of the Oireachtas that are not part of that. There's neither Sinn Féin nor the technical group, for example, in the Dáil have any representation on that. So I think it has to be a wider aspect. But I take the point about it not being exclusively government. But I think that remit would have to be broadened to make sure that it's inclusive. In relation to SIPO. And a lot of what has happened there has been positive, but I do think that I'd like to see greater teeth in relation to sanctions. I could point to several instances where there's flagrant abuse of the limits. But it's up to people to make complaints. It's not that there's a and it's after the event, and people don't do that. It's not kind of in the nature of things. When the battle is over, it's over. I don't think that will come as a surprise to most of us that have contested an election, and even that I think is important. That if you're going to keep confidence, that you've got to have sanctions, and you've got to have meaningful sanctions that will that make sure that the process is as fair as it possibly can be. I'd be interested to hear about what the timetabling, when people say not big bang, what timeline. What is a realistic timeline for putting in place the comprehensive? And I think there'll always be an element of things being added to it. But is it 5 years? Would it need more than that? And what would you ideally like to see as the elements that would go in what order? Them to.
Well, maybe I'll just come back just on a few of the points, certainly. I think one thing that strikes me, and I mean, I have no disagreement with any of the points made about ensuring the integrity of the register of electors. I think the committee may wish to maybe get some information from the Department of Social Protection on their project for the development of a public services identity card, because I think that is a project which is currently underway and which is aiming to effectively have an identity card for every citizen. And I think the structure that will kind of underpin that in terms of an individual identity number and the ability to link it to an image of a person can be useful to the electoral register. And I think there is probably scope there in the longer term to synchronise the systems, and even to have recognition in polling stations and so on when people present their cards. So, I mean, obviously the detail of that would be something that an electoral commission would negotiate with the department. But even to understand the model might give you some ideas about what you would be recommending as ways forward in relation to that. The conflict of interest that I was talking about in relation to the audit of an electoral commission, under the Constitution, it's my obligation as Controller and Auditor General to audit the accounts of all funds under the authority of the Oireachtas. And therefore, if funding is provided by the Oireachtas to an electoral commission, then it would be expected that I would be the auditor of that. Now, in order to ensure that as the auditor I have independence, I can't then be involved in decision making about the application of funds. That's fundamentally the question. I think the difference between the electoral commission, which I think, as envisaged, will be a spending body. There will be substantial funds going through that. Let's say SEPO or a referendum commission. The difference broadly is that there is normally a fairly small budget involved, or in the case of SEPO, it's a very small budget, and there's an accounting officer separately to account for that. But I think once you're into being the auditor who is tasked with reporting to Parliament in relation to how resources are managed and applied, it wouldn't be consistent to be on the inside making the decisions and so on. So that was really the point I was making. I was drawing a distinction between possibly putting a system in place with an accounting officer where the Commission, if you like, would sit above the accounting officer level and wouldn't necessarily be involved in the day-to-day resourcing decisions. There could be a model kind of crafted, but I think when it comes down to performance and where decisions would be made about, let's say, developing a big IT system to underpin the voter registration and identification, I think it would be very difficult for somebody on the Commission to also be the auditor. I think the point about SEPO and more teeth, I think certainly we'd agree that maybe we're not always in a position as a commission, because we act within the law and within the parameters set down by Parliament. In terms of, I think the point you made about spending limits, I think that's in electoral spending, and where there are limits in place. And I think there are strict rules around when does the clock start ticking, when does it stop ticking, and you know, I think it is generally recognised that there are ways of doing things, maybe doing things early, anticipating, that give the impression of a campaign up and running. And there's actually quite little that SEPO can do, because we have to operate within the law as it stands. As to timeline, I mean, it depends what you want to do and what it is decided that the Electoral Commission would achieve. But I think looking at the consultation paper, the experience elsewhere has been that this is certainly a multi-year project. I think any major IT project is going to be a 3 to 5 year project anyway. And I think that's generally the experience with sort of large-scale projects. So I think, you know, that timeline of 3, 4, 5 years is probably what you're looking at for a comprehensive shift and realignment of functions.
Thank you. Certainly, the issue of funding, just to pick up that particular point. At the moment, SEPO deals with both electoral funding and the ongoing funding of political parties. And there'd be a question to be answered as to whether you would separate funding specifically related to elections and expenditure in elections, I should say, and funding, ongoing funding of political parties. Now, given the proposals for the future of the ethics regime, there has been an argument that the ongoing funding fits with the ethics and the lobbying, in that they all relate to ongoing political activity as opposed to election-related activity. But I think that's a detailed discussion that would have to be teased out, because the proposal in the ethics legislation to set up a standards commissioner might well have an impact on how you would decide where that function should locate. That's ongoing political party funding. On the issue, just picking up an aside, Controller and Auditor General has talked about the impact on his role of creating an electoral commission and the role of ex officio members and how that might transfer. Just an observation, electoral commissions in some other countries do fall within the Parliamentary Ombudsman's jurisdiction. So we're decided for the future, and that's another decision that will have to be made as part of the ongoing consideration of legislation, to bring the any electoral commission within the Ombudsman's jurisdiction, then obviously that would have an impact on the possibility of an ex officio role for the Ombudsman. I certainly would endorse the issue about sanctions and more teeth. I think the current regime probably is designed in a way that makes it very difficult to actively enforce it. And you would hope that any new regime could be more actively enforced to deal with the kind of issues that you properly were raising. On the issue of a timeline, it would seem to me that a lot relates to the potential for when there may be a referendum in the next Parliament, in the next Oireachtas, when the next set of elections might be. Seems that to me that it would be helpful, for instance, to get some of the aspects relating to a referendum in place before a referendum takes place under the auspices of a new Dáil. So that's probably a consideration in the timeline. Similarly, I would have said 3 to 5 years. I would say 5 years on the outside, really, because it would be good to see something in place. On the issue of just coming back to the issue of appointments a moment, I picked up the issue about the the Oireachtas current arrangements perhaps not being seen to be all encompassing in terms of the various political parties. It seems to me that fundamentally, though, that there should be an objective appointment process of the kind that appoints to public bodies, and that the appointments subsequently should be ratified by the Oireachtas. So they're seen to be owned by the Oireachtas, but undertaken in an objective and neutral fashion. I think that would give confidence, greater confidence in the new arrangements. And I think I've probably dealt with the what elements should be included. As I say, I'm just taking the point. Neither SIPO nor the Referendum Commission have taken a view about the role of local government, and so that it didn't fall within our broad remit, and it didn't seem appropriate to comment. But so the ongoing points being made by the representatives of local government are probably of more relevance than anything that it would be appropriate for us to say.
Okay, Mr. Petty-Walsh.
Just for the Deputy's information, as far back as 2003, the Standards Commission raised the issue of the election spending and the election period and what it is appropriate to cover. As you probably know, it covers from the date the election is called until polling day, whereas a lot of money is front-loaded in the weeks in advance, especially when it is known that there will be an election. There's a lot of front-loading done. So as far back in 2003, the Commission raised that issue mere 12 years ago. So I think it's also important to know that in relation to teeth, the problem with the absence of teeth is in the legislation. And again, over the years, the Commission has raised the issue of the absence of teeth in the electoral legislation. The Commission can write to individuals in relation to various aspects of what we suspect they're doing. They can completely ignore it, and there is no sanction for them failing to respond to it. So we would obviously, I think the Commission would be saying to any electoral commission, look at all of the recommendations that the Commission has made over the last 12 years, and they will be starting from a good point to encompass it in any new legislation.
Mr. McCarthy, come back in there.
Just on the point that Deputy Murphy raised about the political funding as well, I think Mr. Tyndall has referred to the distinction to be drawn between political funding, ongoing political funding, which I did a quick analysis this morning. It's running about 13 to 14 million a year for parliamentary leaders' allowance, Electoral Act funding, and funding to independents.
Our state funding for political parties is 13 million per year.
It's 13 to 14.
And that's through the party leaders' allowance and
party leaders' allowance, Section 17, Electoral Act 1997 funding, and then it breaks down basically parliamentary leaders' allowance about 7 million, Electoral Act about 5.5 million, and then payments to independents about 800,000, and that's relatively stable year on year. When you look at the monies, and these are all monies that go through the finance accounts, the Exchequer, or come from the Exchequer, returning officers' expenses, the reimbursement of expenses to candidates, election postal charges, and then if you add in referendum commission costs when referendums arise. And the variance there is incredible. It's from 15.5 million in 2013 to 65 million in 2011 when there was a general election. It reflects the number of elections. Obviously in 2011 you had general election, presidential election and referendums on the same day as presidential election. Then there was other periods when there was 2 referendums in the year. You have European and local elections, so it is quite variable, but between 15 and 65 million. I think one of the things that has struck me as an auditor and as a member of SIPO is the complexity of the onus on political parties and on public representatives to account for the monies that they get, because the monies come under several guises and have to be accounted for separately under separate guises. And there is this, there's a clear distinction between ongoing political funding for administrative purposes and then monies that are spent in the course of electoral campaigning, which isn't funded from the public purse. I think and I hope that the accounting for political parties, which will kick in with effect from 2015 and be reported in 2016, will bring a bit more clarity to the whole exercise of provision of public funding and the accounting, the accounting for that. And obviously, there will need to be a distinction in the accounting between monies for administrative, normal, ongoing purposes and campaign funding. And the guidelines that have been issued by SIPO require that kind of distinction to be made. As I said, I think comprehensive reporting by political parties will be a major step forward in terms of knowing what's spent and how it's spent.
Mr. McCarthy, can I just ask you, what, in your estimation, does a referendum cost the Exchequer?
In terms of the direct spend through the Exchequer, I think it's of the order of 15 to 15.5 million. Now, there may be local authority expenditure as well, and you know, if there's only a referendum in a year, there's obviously costs associated with maintaining the register and the preparedness, if you like, for the thing. But in terms of the funding that comes from the Exchequer, it's about 15 million. In 2014, when you had European and local elections, the Exchequer paid out about 28 million.
28 million. Does anybody else want to get in on those points that Deputy Murphy raised? Mr. Nugent,
Chairman, just in relation to the issues of identity, prior to taking up this role, I served as 5 years as head of the Passport Service, and it's interesting that many of the issues associated with public identity are also emerging here. And I concur with Deputy Murphy in relation to the need to associate some of those other initiatives that are underway, whether that's the public services card or other ways, and I think that's important. None of them at this point, though, tackle all of the issues that are there. I have a public services card myself, but it doesn't tell you, for example, your citizenship. So your entitlement to vote in different types of election would be very different. Notwithstanding that, I think clearly the use of the PPSN does have sensitivities. We all accept that, and clearly we need to make sure that if it's being used within the confines of the trust that the electorate give to us. But it is invaluable not just for the purposes of mitigating against people appearing on more than one register, but it does allow for that linkage to death events that will be recorded by the GRO and allow for that automatic processing of materials. In relation to some timing issues, I think this is an area that needs careful consideration. Clearly, the Electoral Acts as amended provide timelines for certain existing parameters and infrastructure. So registration authorities are defined, The timelines for the register are also defined, so one would need to be very careful in drafting legislation that doesn't fall between problems associated with commencement of new provisions, and that all of the necessary infrastructure will be in place around the establishment of a new regime, whatever that might be. And then to come back to the point I think that we had said in our opening submission, we've referenced to the fact that there is this comment on the register. There are 31 unconnected registers as it stands, and that would certainly seem like an appropriate place to start to look at those issues and see how one can provide the legislative background or legislative authority to bring that together into something that's more coherent, and through the introduction of a unique identifier, assist in that process. And finally, with the pressures associated with deadlines, a rolling register, in our view, is a key element associated with removing some of the impediments to the current process.
Thank you, Mr. Nugent. Yes, please, Mr.
Chairman, can I just mention on the whole area of the registration process that Dublin City Council is probably one of the few local authorities that still uses inspectors to go around and check the register. But we find now increasingly that there is difficulty with access to premises. There's a lot of gated communities around, so very often we don't get that access. And what's really required at this stage is an online facility so that people can actually communicate with the local authority or the registration authority to register their intention to vote. And we firmly believe that minimal legislation changes would facilitate that and would make it much easier for people to vote. Now, I know that's one element of what the committee are actually considering at the moment, but I know that the registration process has been an issue of concern to very many members of the committee here, but minimal changes will enable that to take place, and that combined with a rolling register would make it a lot easier for people to access and get on the voters register. The point that Deputy Murphy makes about the whole area of postal votes is also very important, because increasingly we have people that are away on holidays, people at work, people on holiday, people in hospital that cannot vote, and they increasingly ask for a postal vote which is not available to them. So that's maybe something else that could be considered in your deliberations on the whole process.
Thank you, Mr. Norton. Senator Terry Brennan.
Again, at first, could I say I'm sorry that I wasn't here for the submissions. We had 2 or 3 votes in the Senate, so I was late coming here. Just a couple of things, and from my own experience, and I'm not sure who the county manager was or who the county registrar was at the time, but I met this guy. I forget which elections, whether it was 2011 or the previous local elections, but he was after voting 9 or 10 times in Northern Ireland. He had spent the day going round, I don't know how many polling stations in various parts of Northern Ireland, registered in County Louth, and I went to one of the supplementary to the register, you know, the last list of people adding. Lo and behold, I got to see his name on the supplementary register for County Louth, and then discovered that he's on the register 5 times in County Louth, and where he lived. Anyway, I know that he had only 1 vote, but I think it's something that happens more often than we think, particularly in border counties. For whatever reason, and I think it was who said the PPS number, and they were looking seriously at it. I think it's the only way to ensure that this cannot happen, that you have a number 7, 8, 9, 10 or whatever, and it comes up every time. But that is actually true. Now, that person still living in County Louth, I'm sure, has only got 1 vote at this stage. But had I not been at that at that meeting and identified him with it was a rate collector at the time. I said, is that a chubby guy with a curly head and whatever he was able to tell me he was. But he was on the register 5 times. And that's true. We must stop that situation, and the only way to do it, in my opinion, maybe there is another way to stop it. The question of living away from home, and my family are living away from home. They hadn't got their bums on seats till they were off the register in County Louth. And I blame that to the person that was going around doing the local scene, and he was keeping the register up to date, and depending on what his or her politics were, you were gone from the register. Now, that is the reality. I know people that are on the register and that are married with families in London and Belfast, and they're still on our register. Now, I have never, I hope, done a wrong turn on anybody, and I don't intend reporting them. But there has to be some way to ensure that that doesn't. I have a family coming home in 6 weeks' time. If they were still on the register, they could vote in whatever. That is reality, and that is happening. And the other issue about somebody that dies and, okay, they have a PPS number, I think public representatives should be able to let the county know that Terry Brennan of Ganroad, Carneyford is dead and gone. I don't think anyone would do that and say that maliciously. I don't know how long people who are dead, and I think we could ensure and keep the registers more up to date. I'm sure in the deliberations you said before I came in, but I think the only way, maybe there's other ways, but having a PPS or PRSI number would eliminate an awful lot of what's going on. If they're away from home and they have a PPRS number and they're away for years, if they haven't used it for years, it should turn up and say, hey, where were you for the last? But that's the reality. I know people myself that are living in London, married families, and still on local registers. I don't know who's to blame, or whether it's party political broadcast or party political, but maybe that's what it is. But just to ensure and keep the registers as much as we can, we all have a contribution to make, and I think that's the way it should be, to have a more up-to-date register than we have throughout the country. I'm not saying in County Louth. I'd say it's very, very, very good in County Louth. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Does anybody want to respond to that? Mr. Norton.
Just in response to that, you see, at the present time, it's a household return in respect of voting on the register. So very often you find that the family, the head of the household, will make the return even though people are away. And what we should look for is individual responsibility in relation to registering to vote, with the PPS number as well. What we do in Dublin City is we get dates of birth, and very often we can do searches to make sure that there isn't duplication. But the ideal response is a PPS number and individual registration.
What's the big problem with having a PPS number? Does everybody have a PPS number?
Everyone has a PPS number. I think the issue is around data protection, and we've seen the issues that it has caused in other areas. But I think if there is responsibility to submit the PPS number, but that it's not held, it's only used initially as a verification process, that would be the way around it.
Okay, thank you.
Senator Keane.
Thank you. And again, like Senator Brennan, I want to apologise because I was detained in the Shannon, and you're very welcome. And obviously it's a debate that was had before, and we're having it again. And I think looking back at the Geary Institute report and the recommendations in that, I think that gives some food for thought as well on how we should proceed maybe from here. Just to go along with, I know there's some very good submissions in, and I think that's one of the good things of this committee, that we can look at submissions from outside bodies, academia, and and other people who are, they say politicians, you know, when you're in the middle of it, you're the worst person to look at it maybe. So when you get outside academia view inside in the submissions, I want to thank the people who are not here today who made submissions, and particular, I won't mention any names, but the PPS number, yes, absolutely. The savings, I think, would be minimal if they were taken from local authorities, and I'd like to see an analysis done on that to say exactly what it would be, if it would be anything. I have been on the local authority for 25 years, South Dublin County Council, and I must say that South Dublin was one of the first local authorities that went very mod in IT, and I think local authorities are well equipped now to go and equip themselves, even more modern, to link in with any national body. And I welcome the formation of the Electoral Commission list, you get me wrong. I do think it's very necessary, but I don't think it's necessary to subsume all the role of what local authorities are doing, and I think it should be absolutely tabulated what roles each body should have, because I spoke all my life, and I'm not going to change now, about devolution of function to local authorities. Too many things are centralised, and we must have devolution of function. And who better to know people on the ground? Senator Brennan there was talking about duplication and whatever. The rate collectors long ago was where it came from, and you know everybody, whatever. But we also have local people in local authorities, and as again you have local councillors. You have all that local information. If too much is centralised, you're going to lose all that. And I noticed there was a good submission in as well from the AILG on particularly on those issues on what you would lose if it were all centralised. There's some things that should be centralised and must be centralised to do it. The single coordinating body is a necessity, but as I said, other than that, you have administration which can be done locally, but you have oversight and overseeing and everything above. Now, I want to say, in my experience in local government, everything in the electoral register has been above reproach. But there are, you say, issues about, and I think you mentioned it there, and that was one thing that I had written down about household registration versus individualisation of registration, which is very necessary. And the PPS number, I would say, has to be used, because there's no other identifiable way really in this country. And I know we ran into trouble with it before when it was recommended that it should be used for, God forbid I'd mentioned the word water, but it is an identifiable means, and it has to be held for a specific purpose, and I think this is a purpose that it should be held for. The accuracy of the electoral register is called into questions, and indeed every councillor, every TD, every senator around the place has pointed out inaccuracies, and it's not necessary to deregister in one county before you register in another one. That's a thing that's absolutely mad. It should be absolutely near, and I won't say an offence because people could do it without knowing, but it should be publicised. It should be made, you don't have to deregister. You can be in one county and move house, and with the housing situation, the mobility that's now there, it is a feature that should be, and with, again, I want to compliment the checktheregister.ie, because it has moved on a lot from where when I started off. The link with the birth, marriages and deaths. Again, a necessity, because when a person dies, if it pops up in a red flag straight away, just remove it. Let it be there. Link it. RIP.ie, you have it every day, you know. Well, please God you wouldn't have it every day. But I use the opportunity to say this morning at Owen Culligan's funeral, and it puts everything in perspective. The enhancing participation, I think, should be a national issue, a role that is in, and if the Commission doesn't enhance participation, they should be sacked straight away, and there should be a comeback on that as well. So the absence of centralised data, and we are depending on, and I get emails, you know, for centralised data, who did what, when, what's the tally here and what's the tally there. I think there should be a role for the Commission in that, in looking back. It's historical records. It's left to Sean Donnelly in elections.org or Chris Tugg in electionsireland.org. Incidentally, couldn't open Chris Tugg's submission because the way it was saved in work rather than in PDF or Word. I think it's a thing that I will take up with the IT, but it's a thing that. But definitely those two people, Sean Donnelly and Chris Turk, they do the work of what I would say a national body should do for historical records for electioneering, and that would be aid them aid them in the work because they know what to do. They know how to do it. You don't just, so that would be the political analysis. Obviously, is a political thing. Academia and whatever, but again, I think the Constituency Commission should remain. It's independent, does work there, couldn't be left to. I think SIPO should be amalgamated in some way into the national, the commission, because I do think you don't need two bodies to do the work like that. It's open there, it's independent, and so that would be a role that I would see as well. There are probably other things that I have missed along the way, but I will say there is a need for it. It's a long time coming. The government is and hopefully will do it very shortly, but I would say, and I will reiterate it again, don't throw out the baby with the bathwater, because you could lose more than you gain by taking something from a local authority. They would do it better, obviously, if they had more staff and more IT and more good programme. Now, as I said, the check register. But there are things that you lose, so I'd be careful of centralising everything, because centralisation, devolution is what we're looking for. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chairman. You're very, very welcome. Just in support of some of the previous speakers in relation to I believe the only way forward is in relation to the PPS numbers, because I raised it in the Dáil and again here last week in relation to abuses with draft registers, where in my constituency at the last local elections, the amount of people that were registered who were actually not living in the country at that time, and the draft register came at a very, very late stage, and these people were working in Canada, in America, Australia and various other places, and these people were on the register, but for close examination by certain people to watch these people were not voting. So I mean, in the past, we had rate collectors who looked. I know you're saying in Dublin that you have a different system, but around the country, it's very, very difficult to know who is on the register and who is not on the register. And I think it's vitally important. I have another issue as well, and it's in relation to constituencies. I represent a constituency now that was half part of one county and a full county, say Sligo, North Leitrim. Now we're going into Sligo, full Leitrim, West Cavan and South Donegal. So after the next election, I will be representing, hopefully, 4 counties. And I mean, there's no justification, in my opinion, for the likes of splitting, because I've seen what has happened in Leitrim over the years. There's been a history there over the years because it was suitable for a constituency to be broken up, whether it went to Roscommon, part of it, and into part of Leitrim went into Roscommon, the other part into Sligo. And now all of Leitrim is back in Sligo, but also you have West Cavan, South Donegal. These people feel that they're totally disenfranchised by going into a different constituency whatsoever. And I suppose for us as the public representatives, it's very, very difficult as well. So I'd just like to get perhaps maybe your comments on that, but I also, yes, in relation to some of the questions that were already highlighted here about what I mentioned there in relation to draft registers, and that I think it's vitally important that they would be examined as well, because I think there's huge abuses on registers. Senator Terry mentioned there about a person voting on 9 occasions. It's our business as public representatives and to see that people are registered. And the problem is, come election day, on numerous occasions, people are not on the register. Unfortunately, people that want to vote, and then you have other people on the register, and they're in every town and village in the county, and that's deplorable as well. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Take that then, Mr. McCarthy. Do you want to?
I think just maybe a point on the PPS number, and Senator Keane mentioned about the register of births, marriages and deaths. There is already an automated system based on the PPS number, whereby deaths notified to the registrar feeds automatically into the system in the Department of Social Protection, and payments are stopped. fairly quickly. So and I think the HSE uses that information as well. I think there are 30 services, or more than 30 services, that take the information and automatically feed them in using data matching techniques. But you must have a unique identifier that can link the two sets, the two databases. So I think it is clearly a consensus here. I think that as a control mechanism, it's certainly a way forward. So I think maybe talking to the department about the public services identity card may be worthwhile for your committee's deliberations. That was all.
Mr. Nugent.
Upon Mr McCarthy's comments, and indeed many local authorities, or most all local authorities, do receive the death event notification information by routine, but clearly in the absence of the unique identifier, there are limits in which we can do it. Now clearly there is every effort made to try and match as best one can, but ultimately the absence of that direct linkage with the PPSN is a barrier. If I can just pick up on something Senator Keenan, I appreciate her agreement about the need for local involvement in this. To tell an anecdote of a friend of mine who was saved, whose father was bereaved and whose polling card had been pulled locally as a result of that local awareness, very much referred to by Senator Keane and by Deputy McLaughlin. And that effort locally and that local knowledge, as far as one can, is certainly a very valuable and important element of the process that's put in place. And centralising that and taking away some of that local knowledge, in our view, is not going to address the sort of trust and support that one would necessarily want.
Some of the most disappointed voters who appear at a polling station on the day are the new Irish citizens who have been marked with, as some people will be aware of what I mean, an L beside their name, which means they can only vote in a local election, but who have recently gone through the Irish citizenship ceremony. And I wonder, would it be possible for those people also to be notified, that database to be available to the local authorities in order to verify the change of status?
Got to say was, a big problem that has occurred in the past as well, people arriving at polling stations and finding they're not on the register, having been removed for no good reason other than maybe they weren't there when somebody called or whatever. That has been a problem. So, you know, there has to be double checks and balances that when it is actually clicked off the list that they're actually gone, you know, because that's a huge problem as well.
Good point. Okay, are there any closing statements you wish to make, any of our witnesses? Okay, on that basis, can I thank you most kindly for your assistance this afternoon. That will help us greatly in terms of deliberating the whole issue. Can I just say, in terms of SEPO myself, I stood in a number of elections before I became a TD, but I remember in 2002 there was a Kelly judgment which delayed the time by which forms had to go back. And I just want to put on the record my appreciation for the people I dealt with. I think, Paddy, you might have been one of them, for trying to meet deadlines and trying to get all sorts of assistance, because it was a huge leap to go from virtually no declarations to, you know, filling out forms and getting various limits and getting peace commissioners to sign it. So I appreciate the effort that people go to in offices like SEPO and the professionalism, and indeed the local authorities. We've been lucky in my area in that the register of electors is fairly accurate, and there's a number of traditional reasons for that, but I think when you're in an area where public services is that good, we tend not to appreciate where perhaps the system may not be as good, and there's no reflection on the people concerned, but I think it's the system itself that mightn't be as uniform perhaps as it should be. But thank you very much indeed for your assistance here. You're free to go. Thank you. Okay, we're going to suspend for about 2 minutes and we have a private meeting. We'll take a couple of minutes, okay?